Welcome back to Histories Tech, and today we are looking at the United States Air Force's first supersonic delta wing interceptor, the Convair F-102 Delta Dagger. Now, I am a huge fan of delta wing aircraft, so this one is actually a little bit fun for me to do, and there will actually be several aircraft kind of associated with this that I will be talking about here in the near future. But let's go ahead and look at the development of the 102 Delta Dagger. Now, the development of the Delta Dagger actually came as part of a late 1940s effort to create high-speed interceptors to deal with approaching Soviet strategic bomber fleets, mainly this aircraft, the Tupolev Tu-95. At the time, one of the main interceptors for this cause was the Northrop F-89 Scorpion, actually a personal favorite of mine. Now, the Air Force was aware that jet aircraft were actually developing at an astronomical rate, so there was going to be a need for a new interceptor in the future. So in 1948, they voted to create a program that would develop a ultimate interceptor by 1954. Now, initially, only 18 companies out of 50 responded to the Air Force's call for this new aircraft, and by 1954, only 3 companies still had one in the running. Convair had an aircraft that, while ahead of its time in design, was farther along in research because it was based on the XF-92. Now, the XF-92 was actually built by Convair as a point defense interceptor, and when that was abandoned, it was used for experimental purposes. However, its development allowed Convair to develop not only the F-102, but the F-106, the B-58, the Navy's F-2Y Sea Dart, as well as one of my personal favorite VTOL aircraft, the Pogo. This design is the basis, and the other competition dropping out, the XF-102 was given the go-ahead for development. Now, it wasn't perfect. It went through some issues. Mainly, they had underpowered engines initially. After many of these engine issues were settled, the first YF-102 prototype was ready for flight on October 23, 1953. And the career for the prototype was cut rather short because after 9 days it crashed. A few months later, the second prototype was flown, and it was shown to have a lot of problems. The biggest of these was transonic drag, which decreased the performance of the aircraft and limited it to subsonic speeds, which prevented it from becoming a supersonic interceptor like it was supposed to be. Now, in order to prevent the contract from being canceled, Convair went back and majorly redesigned the aircraft, creating the YF-102A in the process. These major redesigns included lengthening the fuselage by 11 inches, redesigning it into a Coke bottle configuration, redesigning the wings, adding a more powerful engine, and even redesigning the canopy. The redesigned prototype flew only 118 days after they began redesigning the aircraft. The Air Force deemed the redesign proficient and began ordering production aircraft. The 102 saw its first deployment with the 327th Fighter Interceptor Squadron based out of George Air Force Base in California, and it would see its first deployment as an interceptor with the 327th when they were redeployed to Thule Air Base in Greenland. After this, it would actually be continuously deployed to more northern countries as an interceptor aircraft until the 1970s. Now, the only combat the aircraft ever saw was during the Vietnam War, where it saw service as early as 1962, where they were deployed in neighboring countries to prevent any threats against South Vietnam. Additionally, during Operation Arclight, Boeing B-52s were actually escorted by F-102s into their theaters of operation. Did see some limited usage as an air-to-ground vehicle. However, these were never really that successful, and their usage of these was pretty rapidly abandoned. By the mid-1970s, the United States was done utilizing the F-102, and it had actually been replaced. During the 1970s, it would be exported to both Turkey and Greece, and the Turkish F-102s would actually be used during the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. It would be the last conflict the 102 was involved in. The United States would continue to use the F-102 until 1986, but strictly as a drone aircraft to be used for target practice. Beyond the drone variant, there's actually not a lot of variants of the F-102. One of the biggest production versions is the TF-102A. This was the 2-seater training variant that actually saw some modification during the Vietnam War to be utilized for a air-to-ground role. And then, of course, the biggest variant is the Convair F-106 Delta Dart. This aircraft initially started off as the F-102B, but due to all the improvements that were done to the aircraft and to prevent it from competing with the F-102 future variants like the F-102C that they were trying to build, it was allowed its own designation of the F-106. Now, if you would like to see an F-102 today, 6 countries currently have them. There are no flying versions of the F-102 in existence. There are more than 50 of them in the United States alone on display. The very first one I ever saw was at Ellington Air Base, and that one has actually been designated for former President George W. Bush, because that's what he flew with the Texas Air National Guard. Outside of the United States, they can be found in Canada, Germany, Greece, the Netherlands, and Turkey. There you have it, a quick look at the Convair F-102 Delta Dagger, a rather unique and interesting aircraft that was part of kind of this big transition from Convair to trying to experiment with Delta Wing aircraft. While it didn't have as big of a career as some of the other Delta Wing aircraft Convair developed, it did have a lasting impact on the development of Delta Wing aircraft for Convair. It did spawn the development of the F-106 Delta Dart, which was the Air Force's primary all-weather interceptor until the 1980s, when it was replaced by the F-15. That's it for today. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you on the next time.